A big part of my career has been looking at the therapeutic value of the 12 steps because the 12 steps really have harnessed some powerful psychological forces that creates an amazing change in our life. What is that change? Well, the truth is that the 12 steps are engineered to help us achieve emotional sobriety, to achieve true independence of spirit, to achieve autonomy, to learn how to take care of ourselves. These are things that we don't know. Emotional sobriety really helps us learn how to have a healthy relationship, how to have union with the preservation of our integrity, how to cooperate with integrity. Most of us get lost in our relationships. Most of us do a lot of things we don't want to do. We don't really know how to show up in a good way. Emotional sobriety is about learning to have healthy relationships. Now, it is customary to begin our workshop by reading a portion of Bill's AA Grapevine article called The Next Frontier, Emotional Sobriety. And tonight, Susie will be our reader. Susie, good evening. How are you tonight?
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you for asking me to participate.
Thank
And
you
I'm
for
ready.
helping.
So I think that many oldsters who've put our booze cure to severe but successful tests still find that they often lack emotional sobriety. Perhaps they will be the spearhead for the next major development in AA, the development of much more real maturity and balance, which is to say humility, in our relations with ourselves, with our fellows, and with God. Those adolescent urges that so many of us have for top approval, perfect security, and perfect romance, urges quite appropriate to age 17, prove to be an impossible way of life when we are at age 57, 47 or 57, even 77.
Even, yes.
Here's the aha moment that Bill experienced. Suddenly, I realized what the matter was. My basic flaw had always been dependence, almost absolute dependence, on people or circumstances to supply me with prestige, security, and the like. Failing to get these things according to my perfectionist dreams and specifications, I'd fought for them. And when defeat came, so did my depression. The solution Bill discovered was that if we examine every disturbance we have, great or small, we will find at the root of it some unhealthy dependency and its consequent unhealthy demand. Let us, with God's help, continually surrender these hobbling demands. Then we can be set free to live and love. We may then be able to 12-step ourselves and others into emotional sobriety.
Well, as I ask everyone who does the reading, Susie, what
No.
stands out for you?
Well, what stood out for me is this darn thing about being 17 and wanting everything perfect. I did. And I did such a good job of pretending for the rest of my life that everything was perfect. I talk about put blinders on, I built walls, I wore armor, all things to protect myself. And those are the very things I had to tear away. Because as this also says, I had all the answers inside of myself. I just looked outside for the answers. And that isn't the way to do life. So thank you for teaching me all that.
Well, listen, I just wanted to let everybody know that you were on our podcast this last day, and Patrick has put the link in if you'd like to hear Susie share about her experience and especially her experience with emotional sobriety. Thank you so much for tonight and especially for Sunday.
It was fun. Thank you. Thank you for asking me.
Thank you for doing it. Well, we are continuing our exploration of the first insight from my book, 12 Essential Insights for Emotional Sobriety, which was waking up from our sleepwalking. And I wanted to take some time to talk about how we actually go to sleep. And what does it mean that we're sleepwalking through life? How do we get so desensitized to our experience? Or another way of thinking about it is, what happens that we must dull our awareness? And instead of having an awareness that fully embraces who we are, how we become so pedantic and really limit our awareness in life. So how does that happen? How is it that when we're born, we are so born into such a full awareness and we're aware of ourselves and others that through life and through our experiences, that becomes diminished? Well, the answer lies in what's called the psychological adaptation syndrome. PAS, the psychological adaptation syndrome. Now, what is that syndrome? Well, what the syndrome it really says, its theoretical underpinnings, is this idea that was discovered by Dr. Kurt Goldstein, that says this, that we have a tendency, the organism has a tendency to actualize whatever is possible given the current set of conditions that the organism is facing, both externally and internally. So what it says is that, and Rollo May said it in another way, he says, we've got to start to think about neurosis not as a pathology, but as a way that an individual tries to ensure his existence, tries to remain as whole as one possibly can remain given the circumstances that he or she is facing. So when you put these two ideas together, it says that what we will do is we will adapt to any situation in the best way that's available to us, given who we are at that time, what resources we have internally, and also what's available in our environment. Now, since almost every psychologist agrees that our problems start very, very early on in life, it means, and most people say within the first 5 years, I like to think of it as more for the first like 16 years of our life, because I think our development really continues over a longer period of time, is what we do is we adapt to the situation we're in to ensure, as Rollo May said, our existence. So what does that mean? That if we're ensuring our existence, what has to happen? Well, our existence is dependent on being loved and being accepted and belonging. We are social creatures, and it's a very, very deep need in us to be loved. There was a naturalistic experiment that happened at the end of World War II. And it occurred because so many orphans were created through that horrible war and through the death of so many individuals. And so they had these orphanages with hundreds of babies without enough caretakers to be able to pick up these babies and hold them and care for them. Now, they provided these babies with the basic needs. They would make sure that they were fed, that their diapers were changed, that they would have new clothes put on them, but there were not enough caretakers to be able to hold and nurture these children on an emotional level, to hold them close, to create that emotional attachment. And what they found was that the mortality rate of these infants was way above the mortality rate of any other newborn child. What the researchers concluded was that these children had a depression, that they were dying because while their physical needs were met, their emotional needs were not. I'll say that again. They were dying because their physical needs were met, but their emotional needs were not. They suffered from a very unique kind of depression. They could not thrive, not because they didn't have the nourishment, but because they didn't have the emotional nourishment. Now, that naturalist experiment, as tragic as it is, gave us a lot of insight into the importance of connection in relationship and being loved and being able to love. It's such an important part of who we are as human beings. Now, what happens is that if our emotional security is threatened when we're growing up, and our sense of self-acceptance is threatened, that we will adapt to that situation to try to ensure our existence, to keep as much of our wholeness as we possibly can. So we adapt by taking on an idea of who we need to be in order to ensure our love and our acceptance and our belonging, to ensure that we're going to be in a relationship. Now, Dr. Karen Horney, a brilliant, brilliant psychoanalyst. We really think of her more as a neo-Freudian, not as a traditional or classical Freudian, because she got rid of this idea that sex, that the libido was the driving force of development. And what she says, it's not true. It's our relationship. It's our desire to be loved and accepted and belong. That's what shapes us and influences our development, and the need to ensure that in some way. And she says every child is going to go through a period of basic anxiety where they fear that they're not going to have that love and acceptance because of the dynamics that are going on in their family. I think it's also because of the dynamics that are going on in our culture. It's not just our family, because the family transmits one's culture to the child. And there's a lot of ideas in our culture that are very, very problematic. The big one being our focus on having. You know, our culture says, I am more the more I have. So it's not who you are, it's what you have. Do you have beauty? Do you have looks? Do you have this? Do you have that? If you have all those things, then you're going to be loved. Well, those kinds of forces are impinging on our development. And we are developing in response to those things. So if I have an idea of who I'm supposed to be okay, it means I also have an idea of who I'm not supposed to be. Do you follow that? That if we have an idea of who we're supposed to be, that to ensure our love and acceptance, it also means that there's a whole other set of things that I'm not supposed to be. And if any of those characteristics are a part of my personality, I have to get rid of them. I have to disown them. I have to fragment myself and get rid of those things that are going to be a threat to my existence. It's the fragmentation of our personality that puts us to sleep. It's the desire that we have to be something that we're not in order to be okay. So what we do is we adopt a stereotyped version of ourselves, one that fits with this our idealized self, or our image of what an idealized self would be. And as soon as that starts to crystallize in our consciousness, our personality gets fragmented. If you're a little boy, it might not be okay to cry, so any pain is going to be denied. If you're a little girl, being powerful and having your voice and stuff may be denied because it means you're not feminine, and therefore you're not going to be loved. So there's these gender stereotypes that are put on us, but they go way beyond just gender stereotypes. We adopt all kinds of ideas of who we're supposed to be based on what was okay and what wasn't okay in our family. If you asserted yourself and you were punished and you had to pay a price every time you asserted yourself, then you're going to develop the ability to erase yourself to be okay, to adapt to that situation. So our adaptation for survival creates a fragmentation in our personality that then says, these are okay, these attributes, these parts of my personality are fine. I'm going to embrace these. I'm going to show these to the world. I'm going to live these. These things that I'm not supposed to be, I'm not going to want you to see. I'm going to get rid of. So I'm going to push those aside. The more fragmentation I have, the more awareness I lose of who I am. I'll say that again. The more fragmented I am, the more my self-awareness becomes impaired, compromised. I don't want to see those parts of me that don't fit with who I think I should be. So I'm going to get rid of them. And you guess who I'm going to give them to? You. I'm going to project them. So I'm going to set my boundary way too much in my favor and say, I don't have those characteristics, but Tom Potash, man, he's a demanding son of a gun. I'm not demanding, he is. Oh, that guy, Roger Andes, man, he's very self-centered. I'm not self-centered. Roger's self-centered. I project all these things that I have disowned onto the world. And I think I'm seeing you, but actually I'm seeing those parts of me that I don't want to embrace. This was the incredible insight that Hugh Prather had. He wrote a great book back in the 70s called Notes to Myself. I love it. It's a quick read. Each page is a different reflection on something he had. But one of the things he talked about is that whenever he encountered somebody he didn't like, he ended up realizing that what he didn't like about this person was something in himself that he didn't like, that he hadn't come to peace with yet. Well, that's very true. That's what we all have to understand. If we really are seeing something in somebody else that we don't like, we're really seeing a part of ourselves that we've disowned and that we've projected out onto the world. So the more that we've become fragmented, the more we've alienated ourselves from our true self. Now, the issue in our life becomes one is, what part of ourselves have we identified with? So, do we identify with our idealized self, that I must be that person? Do we identify ourselves with our despised self and think nobody's going to love us or care about us? Because if they really knew us, they couldn't love us. In recovery, what happens is that we transcend the identification with these false selves, the despised self and the idealized self, and we now identify with our true self. That's what happens in recovery. And as we identify with our true self, we start to literally recover ourselves. We recover our true self. We recover our awareness. And one way you can measure a person's recovery is by the breadth and depth of their self-awareness. If somebody is really, really working and work the 12 steps and working this emotional sobriety, their awareness is rich and textured. They are able to be aware of what they're doing and how they're doing it. They don't need to play games with themselves. They don't need to be perfect anymore to be okay. They just need to be able to accept themselves as they are to be okay. So you see, one of the things that happens as we start to wake up, our awareness becomes greater and has more texture and depth to it. And now, because our awareness changes to this degree as we wake up, we're able to learn from our experience. You see, before, when your life was governed by all of these should demands comes from the idealized self, the self that we think we have to be. When we are living according to those should demands, then we are definitely not operating with a full awareness of ourselves. We're only focused on who we should be or who we shouldn't be. And everything else is irrelevant in our life. But the more we embrace ourselves as we are, the fuller our awareness is, the more I can learn from any experience I have. And that's what maturity is learning from the experiences we're having. learning from the mistakes we make. But if it's not okay to make a mistake, then how can I learn from it? It's impossible. If I have to be perfect to be okay, how can I learn from being imperfect? If I have to be all-knowing all the time, how can I learn when I'm not, when I'm ignorant? See, we can't. If I have to be loved and I'm not loved, how can I learn from not being loved? What it needs to teach me about how to be in a relationship. You see, that's what sets up all these obstacles to our maturity. Because maturity can be thought of as that maturation can be thought of as acquiring knowledge from our experience and integrating that knowledge into helping us become what we can be. That's the path. And it's a remarkable experience as we go through this. It really is. Those people that you can see are awake, they have a special quality about them. You know, I recall when I first met my sponsor, Tom, back in 1971. And when he came to this meeting, I was just back from Vietnam. I was at the Kaneohe Marine Corps Air Station. I was one of the first Marines admitted into this program to help Vietnam vets with their drug problem. They didn't know what they were doing, so they turned to the AA community. NA wasn't on the island at that point in time back in 1971, and they invited Tom to come in and share his recovery with us. It wasn't one of these approaches, we're going to scare you by talking about how bad drugs were. It was more, we're going to see if we can help entice you, attract you into recovery by seeing what it means for people to be in recovery. So Tom comes in on this Tuesday night, and it was in the summer of 1971, in July sometime. And you got to picture this. There's about 30 combat Vietnam veterans in our fatigues, our military fatigues. And this hippie walks in. He's got his hair pulled back in a ponytail. He's got his John Lennon wire rim glasses on. He's got a, Hawaiian print shirt on and his khaki shorts and his Birkenstocks. I think Birkenstocks were special issued to all the hippies in Hawaii. And so he walks in this room and we're sitting around and we're looking at each other like, what's this guy going to share with us? This guy was out protesting the war where we had our ass on the line fighting it. But our attitude changed after 5 minutes, because what we saw was a man that was doing what we call true speaking. He was speaking to us from his heart. It was the language of the heart that he was talking about. He was talking about things that I felt that I wouldn't dare share with you. He was talking about experiences he had that I wouldn't dare talk about. You see, what I saw that night was a man that had a high degree of emotional freedom. Today, I would say he had emotional sobriety. And there was a part of me that felt if I could get that in my life, if I could have a similar experience as to what Tom has, I might be able to make this life work. I just might be able to figure this out, because that's what I experienced when I was drinking and using, was freedom. That's what I got out of it. And here somebody had that freedom without getting high, without getting drunk. He had that freedom by how he was living his life. He was awake. I was asleep, but I could see. I was starting to wake up enough where I could see the value and the importance of what he had discovered in his life. As I mentioned last time, we need each other. We don't need each other. We're not needing each other in terms of to be okay, but we need each other to wake up. By sharing our experience, strength, and hope with each other. By sharing our stories, by sharing our experiences. By showing that it's okay to be who we are. We don't have to be who we think we should be. Acceptance is a prerequisite for change. Accepting that we're asleep starts to open up our eyes to the possibility of waking up and start to seeing where we're asleep. Next week, I'm going to continue the discussion of this, and I will talk about the paths that we typically take when we pursue this idealized self. But I just wanted to mention that these are the forces. This is the dynamic that puts us to sleep. So I'm going to invite Herb in, and he can make some comments about that. And it's the two last men standing here,
Herb. Has something to do with our haircut.
I think that's it. Those guys got to cut their hair. Then they're going to be more immune to some of this crap that's going on in their life.
Oh my goodness. Thank you, Alan, very much.
Good to see you tonight, Herb. It's
very thoughtful, very thought-provoking. I'm not quite sure where I can get some traction. I've got a lot of thoughts about this. One of my favorite subjects, of course, is asleep being brought to being awake. There's a combination there, that willingness and grace combination, which I'm very comfortable with talking about, not because I understand it, but because I have experienced it. An advocate, huge advocate of psychology and self-help from a variety of experiences and exposures, but eventually, and I had a deep spiritual orientation and framework and foundation, which was more theoretical than actual, but there was an integration at around age 50 where I brought the self-help information and energy and exposure to connect to all the spiritual information I had and exposure. And it had a catalyst of it coming together in a very dramatic way of an experience. And the dynamic was, and I think this is the heart of the matter of what you're talking about, with at least coming from my experience and my vocabulary, is I needed to get some information. I really did need, but I was open to get the information because I was suffering. And that was the catalyst that brought me to the hospital. My wife was suffering, therefore we were suffering. I didn't know that I was also suffering because I had a problem, but there was overall suffering in the family. And they began asking me to ask myself questions. The very beginning of this process of awakening, from my standpoint, was precipitated because I had suffering and I didn't want suffering. So I was searching, and I'm not sure why I was willing to actually search and or willing to listen and was willing to take action. But all of that's part of the formula. I was willing to listen and I was willing to take action. And as a result of that, I began to have an experience for the very first time, an experience literally more than information, but an experience that moved me to move my feet way beyond my ability to understand and be willing to take action. I didn't know that at the time, but there was a, from my standpoint, the only explanation I have, there was an X plus factor, because I had had a lot of information and I had taken a lot of action, but I hadn't had any real radical at the depth change. And part of the note I made was, oh, by the way, the Jesuits feel that, and have said way back when, 100 years ago, in terms of human development, they said, you give us your child for the first 7 years and we will own them. You give us we will train them, we will own them. It'll be just, so that falls right in line with what you said. But that wonderful ancient phrase that we've heard in meetings, are we human beings seeking a spiritual experience or spiritual beings seeking a human experience? And I think it's structural. You don't talk as much about it as I do. You come more from a psychological terminology and a training and all of the rest of that in terms of human development. But I personally, and I'm saying more than I actually know, think that it's a thank you for laughing. It's a spiritual, it's a mystical, it's a theological component built into the structure of us as a human being. Are we human seeking a spiritual experience? Yes. Are we spiritual seeking a human experience? Yes. It's that organismic integration, and the sense of separateness is a delusion. And that's what that Carl Jung had said about the spirit versus the spirits, and that we have this intense existential longing, my words, not his, for connection, but to the divine. We get distracted by the material, the finite, because that's what's obvious to us. And then going back to what you indicated as that default position, it's the easier, softer way. Who wants to work that hard? Sure, I don't like to suffer, and I'll do what I can to not die and not suffer, but I'll do the least necessary in order to get comfortable. And one of the things I just heard recently was just a catalyst for me. I haven't sorted it all out, but I asked the question some time ago of a fellow from Hazleton, when did meetings become the program? And he said 1976. And I was startled, because it was the time, he said, that business and medicine professionals found there was a business there, in the best of senses, well-intentioned, in helping people recover. They did that 30, 60, 90 days in professional recovery. Then they sent them to AA, and they said, now go to meetings. And the meeting said, welcome. And unfortunately, most of the people in the meetings had settled for comfort, and they got into a support system. I'd never heard it phrased this way. It was just last week, Alan, that I heard this. They got into a support system, and it was good enough. Why do we have the kind of relapse that we have now that perhaps we didn't have back in the early day? Because at least this particular author that woke me up to this just a week ago said, in the beginning, the suffering was alleviated by a relationship with God, and now the suffering is alleviated by a relationship with AA. And it's a human development system rather than a mystical spiritual system.
Well, and we can even say to her, see, early on, see, this is what happened, is that the whole 12-step experience, right? 12-stepping someone was now replaced by vans. And people got in a van and went to the meeting instead of got in somebody's car and was driven to a meeting. I remember, you remember when Wally P, we went to his workshop together, and he said, you know, early on, the guys would come and pick you up and give you a new suit of clothes. I mean, the relationship was so personal then, right? And like you said, you were really brought into the mystery through that relationship.
Yeah, yes. And it was, sir, go to meetings, and yes, read the book, and yes, work the steps for the purpose of finding God. And the meeting's not God, and the sponsor's not God, and the big book and the steps is not God. I'm speaking from the 12-step spiritual angle, and I'm very comfortable using the word, even though there may be lots of people with hesitation about the word God, and I have it in the broadest of senses, not in the traditional religious sense. You know that, Alan, but maybe some other people don't. But the rest of that formula is, so I had suffering, and I was open then to hearing the question and taking the answer, taking the actions, and then having an experience. As a result of having an experience, it raised more questions. And I got some more information, and I took some more action. And I had a new experience, which raised more questions. And there's the dynamic. And Bill, in a different way, but same kind of dynamic of a formula, in the letter emotional sobriety that we talk about. And I've taken that one of the phrases and done quite a bit of reflection on it, that healing circuit. Totally relevant to what you talked about in Dr. Horney and et cetera, in terms of this whole self-esteem issue that we've been addressing, and that is the healing circuit. When I realize that I am loved, I realize I'm lovable. Once I begin to connect to the experience of being lovable, I'm capable of loving. And when I reach out to touch somebody else, giving them a sense of being loved, they get it. They're lovable. Therefore, they then can, in fact, carry that message of loving to somebody so that they're lovable. And that's that healing circuit, which is, from my standpoint, a real explanation of, number one, recovery, the need for community, the health and benefit of the community, and the answer to the question, am I a human being seeking a spiritual experience or a spiritual being seeking a human experience? And the answer is yes. I don't understand all of the dynamic, but as you heard me say, when I look back over my shoulder, I have a frame of reference to explain it. I don't understand it, but it's all in the, I need some information, I need to take some action, but I needed some help from a person to give me the information, and I needed some help from a community to support that journey. And like you heard Tom, in some magical way, originally, I heard this man at 4 years of sobriety, and his words were good and his bearing was wonderful, but there was a tone in his voice that was magnetic. There was something at a level deeper than I'd ever vibrated with in my entire life. And I knew that he knew, and I wasn't even conscious of those words, but I was so attracted to him, and fortunately he said he would help me, and he did, and the rest is history. So I'm not sure if that all fit into that, but it goes back to the belief system that you talked about. We are limited by our belief system, and that's the thing that needs to be reframed and reformed. There you go.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I was thinking of sharing one more thing tonight, just to kind of emphasize the power of the interpersonal relationships in our life and how they shape us, right? And I got this example from my work with Dr. Kempler, and let me set it up, and then I'll share it with you, and you'll see the impact of this. So I've got a little 5-year-old girl, Cecilia, and she goes to kindergarten. She walks back home, and she's got a picture that she made. And she walks in and she goes, Daddy, 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 look at what I did at school today. Now, being a good father, what's my first response? Oh, Cece, that's so great, right? Because I'm trying to do what? Build up her self-esteem. So I'm going to say, Cece, that's an incredible picture. Oh my God, you're going to be an amazing artist when you get older. Let's hang it up right here on the refrigerator. And I get a magnet and I put it up, or I got a cork board and I put it up on the cork board with a pin. Cece goes back to school the next day and she's doing her artwork. And what do you think Cece's thinking about? Well, she's thinking about, how's Daddy going to like this when I show him this picture when I come home? What happens? She comes home and I'm focused on something else and I don't celebrate her in the same way. Wow, that's going to throw her in kind of a crisis, isn't it? A little crisis. Now, imagine what happens if instead of me evaluating Cece's artwork, that I see Cece instead of the artwork. So let me give you an alternative way of greeting her. She walks in the door. She's holding up this picture. Daddy, 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 look at what I did. And instead of saying what a great piece of artwork it is, I say to her, wow, you are so excited about what you did today. You feel great about it. Hey, what do you like about it? Tell me about that picture. What stands out for you? What do you like so much about it that you're so excited about? What about the experience you had when you did it? What did you like about that? Now, when Cece goes back to school after I've done that and seen her, what is she thinking about? What's important to her? She's not thinking about, is daddy going to give her a good grade? Is daddy going to like this one? So what am I building in? By thinking, I'm reinforcing her self-esteem and telling her how good her artwork was. I'm really making her dependent on other people's ideas of what she does to feel good about herself. Now, that corruption of the true self is done by a well-intentioned father. Now, you can imagine if there's malevolence involved in this stuff, what happens to a kid, right? But I'm just talking about well-intentioned. Well-intentioned parent can still mess up a child unintentionally by that kind of behavior. Yeah, Herb, you're gonna.
Well, it's perfect because it's part of the note I left off because I didn't want to take up too much time, but you're now just rounding it out from my standpoint of the picture, because what I discovered at the end of that process, 4 or 5 years sober with this man, was that I was looking outside of me for confirmation. I read the book, The Power Look. I got the house. I had the car. I had all, I was sober, all on the outside. And if you asked me, I would tell you about it. But there was nothing in the inside. I was searching on the outside to fix the inside. And you've said it, the center of gravity is deep inside ourselves. And so no one's coming. Nothing's coming. All right.
Yeah.
I am the one I'm waiting for, and it's deep inside of me. And it might be a healthy relationship with my higher self, and that would be just wonderful. My solution, the words I use, comes essentially from the big book and sort of a mystical spirituality that I'm longing for a connection with the spirit with a capital S that's deep down inside of me. And when I have that, everything else blooms.
And we could even say that that's what happens if you truly get connected to yourself. You're connected to the God within you. I mean, we talk
and
about
the God within them.
That's
Namaste.
right.
Namaste.
There you go. That's right.
The God in me salutes
God
the
in
God
me
in you.
and the God in the presence all around me. Right on.
Exactly. I mean, that's the healing circuit right
But,
there.
but you get that, just from the example, I gave one transaction between a father. Do you know how many millions of those we have in our life? How school is set up that way? I mean,
Well, that's why advertising is so important, because most people don't know that.
that's right. Well, and listen, what I say is, and I used to think that maybe this was some leftover paranoia from a bad acid trip, but I do believe there's a conspiracy against the true self.
There's no question.
It just is. It's just our
Because
culture.
there's no money in it.
Well, there's no money in it. It's a culture based on having, not on being. So look,
The more you have, the more you are.
that's right. So we are counterculture. You guys are now just accepted into the counterculture movement.
Yeah.
And welcome.
It's counterintuitive until you realize it's countercultural, and it's actually the truth. We were believing a lie that we thought was the truth.
It's a big lie.
When we turn it inside out, we discover the truth.
That's right. There you go.
Does someone need to believe in God to successfully overcome addiction? Well, the way I like to think about what the program does, it connects us to who we really are. And what does that mean? Well, there's this incredible force in you and I, this growth force. It's the force that moved us from crawling to walking. You wanted to take those first steps. And when you fell, and you fell a lot of times, you didn't let your failures stop you. You picked yourself up, you learned from it. And how many times did you fail before you walked? You failed as many times as you needed to. You see that force, I call it a biological imperative, a psychological imperative, a spiritual imperative. It's moving you towards wholeness. It's moving you to be what you can be. Just like in the acorn,